ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I am fortunate enough on this sunny Saturday morning to be joined by Father Paul Robinson. Father, thank you so much for taking the time to join me in the lounge room.
Glad to be here. Glad to be talking to an Aussie again after returning to the United States.
You were posted in Australia for a significant period of time, if I remember.
Yes, I was there for 10 years. I just returned to the States last August, but I was 10 years there in Oz.
Wow. And do you miss Australia?
Well, I certainly miss certain aspects of Australia, that's for sure. It's not as crazy of a country as the United States. This country is, based on what's been happening in the past year, is not exactly the way I remember it. Things are a bit more unstable than when I left. But Australia was always a very quiet place, very recollected place, especially since I was out at the seminary there in Goulburn. Which is out in the bush, you know, just surrounded by merino sheep and sulfur-crested cockatoos, and it's very peaceful.
Yeah, you did have yourself a little slice of paradise out there. I do remember I've attended a couple of Ignatian retreats down there, and you take walks and sheep in the hills, and the metaphors for the material you discuss on retreats, absolutely beautiful. But just to make you feel a little bit better, Father, I think the Australia you left is probably a little bit different to the Australia right now. I think the whole world's gone into a bit of a quasi meltdown over coronavirus. So don't feel
right after I left, you had those huge bushfires. And then I suppose the coronavirus pandemic is affecting you all in similar ways it's affecting us.
Yeah, it definitely is. It's a very strange world that we live in at the moment. Well, whereabouts are you now, Father?
I'm in Denver, Colorado.
Yeah.
More towards the west of the United States, just beside the Rocky Mountains. So you can see the Rocky Mountains when there's not bushfires. We're actually having our own sort of bushfires right now.
I was going to say just out the back window there, but the blinds are down.
Yeah, well, the fires aren't in our backyard, but they're on the other side of the mountains. We're on the east side of the mountains, so the fire's on the west side of the mountains. Yeah. But they're definitely going on right now.
Yeah, wow. That's I did actually hear about that the other day. Somebody said that there are extreme fires in is it California and Colorado? I've heard there are some very, very big bushfires going on over there at the moment.
Yes, I think the bigger bushfires are probably in California, but we're definitely having our fair share of them here in Colorado.
Yeah, right, okay. And can I ask, how has Colorado fared throughout the whole coronavirus pandemic, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, well, I'm assuming your viewership's probably mainly Aussie, but just to explain for the Aussies, the American governmental system, it's very federalist, and what that means is that there's a lot of power at the level of the states to legislate for your local communities. So each state, the response has been very different, and you have some states that didn't lock down at all, and to this day they did basically nothing to lock down, that like South Dakota. You have other states who have basically enforced their citizens to be inside ever since the pandemic was announced. To this day, they're still staying at home, you know. I think Colorado was kind of in the middle. We have a Democrat governor, and a lot of Democrats governors have way overreacted, but thankfully ours did not. And so we opened up fairly early, and thanks be to God, we've been able to keep our church open the whole time. There was a period when we were only able to have groups of 10 in the church at one time. And so we had hours of adoration in the weekends, and our people sign up for a slot, an hour of adoration. They would go to confession, receive Holy Communion. So we did that for 7 weeks, and now after that, the church is opened up. We were able to have limited groups, and now we're having bigger groups. Still not up to 100% capacity, but it was certainly a relief for people to be able to come back and attend Mass. After those 7 weeks of just having hours of adoration. But I think overall, I've been very thankful that the governor has been as sort of broad-minded as he has. Could have been a lot worse.
Yeah, well, good to hear. If only everybody was so reasonable. So it gives us reason to pray. So better get down to business, Father, because I've only got you for limited time. So I guess if we can kick off, I want to ask you some questions about your personal Catholic narrative. So you're a native of Kentucky, I understand.
That's correct. That's correct. So, you know, I grew up, I was born in 76. So this is 11 years after the ending of the Second Vatican Council. And it was a very confusing time for Catholics. And there wasn't much of what we call traditional Catholicism around at that time, including in the United States. You know, the Society of St. Pius X, to which I now belong, was founded in 1970. But after the council, there needed to be a decades upon decades for a traditional movement to really grab hold and spread throughout the world. And that hadn't really happened. But we were fortunate in that, I was fortunate in two respects. One was I had a very holy grandfather who gave us such a beautiful example in his living of the faith. And when the new mass came along, he did not like it. I mean, he knew there was something wrong, even though he wasn't an intellectual, you know, he wasn't a man who was a deep reader or anything like that. But he had a deep faith. And so he had that supernatural spirit. He was able to sense that the new mass was spiritually bankrupt. So, and then the second thing was that there was a priest in Kentucky who also did not like the new mass. And so what he did was he came to my hometown and started offering the traditional mass for people who wanted it, and started offering it in the house, someone's house. You know, and my grandfather took my mother there and her siblings. And so I was really a cradle traditional Catholic as a result. I think that was fairly rare for people of my age, because there weren't many available traditional masses in those decades, in those early decades.
And how did you find growing up as a cradle traditional Catholic? So, I mean, fast forward to 2020, and I think there would be a degree of similarity, even though it's, you know, quite different. The one similarity being you are still quite unique if you profess traditional forms of Catholicism. But I can imagine it would have been a far more unique / desperate situation back in those days.
Yes. I think the major contrast between what we are able to provide to our people, for instance, in Denver now, or what you've gotten in Brisbane, is that we were very isolated. We were much more isolated when I was growing up. I was, as I mentioned, there was just this one priest. He was going solo, saying the traditional mass, and he just had that one chapel. He started a school there, so it was a very small community, and you didn't interact with other people. I mean, if you're there in Brisbane, you're like, hey, I'll just head down to Sydney, and I'll go to Mass in Rockdale, and I'll see the people there. Or, you know, you understand that you're connected to a vast network of traditional Catholics. We didn't have that sense at all. We just saw there's one priest, and there's just these people are our Catholic community. In that sense, it was challenging to feel connected to the broader Catholic world. Whereas now, as I say, we're able to provide the youth especially with a much broader community. Here in Denver, we have a pilgrimage every year. We just had it this past Saturday, but you know, for me, that's something that the youth really like. But the fact that we're able to attract all these people from like St. Mary's, Kansas, you know, or they'll come from California, or they'll come from Oregon, or whatever, is just a picture of that broader swath of traditional Catholicism that extends way beyond one church that we didn't have in the 70s and the 80s.
Mm-hmm. And if I can even maybe take a step back from there. So you were brought up a traditional Catholic. Was Catholicism generally something that you had no issues accepting growing up?
I did not go through any real crisis of faith. The issues, any issues that I would have had were minor. I grew up, one of the things about this chapel is the priest believed in something called Fenianism. This is the idea that only baptism of water can get you to heaven. That if you are not baptized with water with the proper form and matter and intention, you just can't go to heaven. And this is not the teaching of the church. So yet it was what I was taught growing up. And so I had to sort of work out that. I did come in contact with some sedevacantists who believe that basically there's not been a pope since the 50s, since the late 50s. And I was never a sedevacantist myself, but it was something I had to sort of research and decide which way I wanted to go. But I think these issues are relatively minor in relation to the crisis of faith that a lot of Nova Scotia Catholics underwent in those decades.
Right. And fast forward, at some point in time, you obtained, well, correct me if I'm wrong, a master's degree in engineering, mathematics, and computer science.
Yes. It's kind of weird. They call it EMAX. That's the acronym for engineering, mathematics, and computer science. It was kind of a hybrid degree at the time. It's just one degree. So I got a bachelor's and a master's in that degree. And I worked for a couple of years in that degree at a company called Lexmark. They make printers. They're in Lexington, Kentucky, my home state. So, yeah, I mean, I guess I've always been sort of more of a systematic thinker and like things logically worked out. And the faith was always appealing in that regard. I feel like the Catholicism is perhaps the most intellectual of the religions out there, in the sense that things are worked out in a logical fashion to a very great detail. So for those minds who are looking for a coherent system that is logically, internally logical, then Catholicism is very satisfying.
And that's interesting. And would that be the underlying hypothesis or thesis in your book? Is it the Realist Guide to Religion and Science? That is the title.
Yes, the Realist Guide to Religion and Science. That's correct.
I did get that right. No, I really look forward to discussing that. But just before we jump into that, you were ordained a priest in 2006. Am I correct?
Correct.
And I think this would be a really interesting issue to explore, just given some of our viewers are not necessarily Catholic. I want to ask, what was it that made you decide that you wanted to give your life to God and become a Catholic priest?
Yeah, so as I say, I was always someone who wanted to have, who enjoyed a certain intellectual clarity and working things out, even with regards to choices made in life. And I think you would understand, Tom, how Catholics who are growing up view the whole life path question. We all know that God has a plan for us. We believe, we have this faith that God made us for a certain reason and that there's a path that he wants us to follow, and we just have to discern his providence and figure out what he wants for us. So I very much had that idea. But I kind of wanted to work it out using like a flow chart. You've probably seen a few flow charts in my book.
Yes.
I kind of want to work it out that way. But I very much had in my mind that this is something I had to figure out. What does God want me to do? But it just took me a bit of time to understand that the only way to clearly discern whether he wanted me to be a priest was to enter the seminary. So it was one of those cold logical decisions. I need to figure out what God wants me to do in this life. It's possible that he wants me to be a priest. And the only way I will really know is if I enter the seminary. So this is, from the perspective of many people, just far too unemotional, a path to get to the seminary. It's just a logical process. Most people see a future priest entering the seminary because he has this great affection for the priesthood, or from the time he was 14, he was just dreaming of becoming a priest, and that. So that just wasn't the case for me. It was like, I need to do what God wants me to do in this life. It could be he wants me to be a priest, and the only way I'm going to figure it out is by entering the seminary. full stop.
Wow. And the rest is history.
And the rest is history. Exactly right. I mean, once I got to the seminary, it just was automatic. It was like, this is where I'm supposed to be. It was obvious to me. Again, I mean, there's some seminarians who go through rough patches in the seminary, but that didn't happen to me. It's just my difficulty was getting there and working it out and figuring it out that, no, I can't just sort of work this out like a mathematical problem. I need to have someone else discern my vocation and tell me. I can't discern this myself, so I need to go. But once I got there, it was like, oh, yeah, this is where I'm supposed to be.
Yeah, okay, wow. Well, let's jump into your book, time permitting. So The Realist's Guide to Religion and Science, you published that. I remember, I think, when you were in Australia and you did a bit of a tour to spruik the book. That was a few years ago now?
Yes, that was 2018. So the book was published in January 2018. I think I did my first book launch in New Zealand, in fact, in Wanganui. But then I went to several places in Australia as well.
Okay. And what I have found, I must confess, when I arranged this interview with you, I ran to the library and I borrowed a copy because I've been meaning to read it, but I have not yet had the chance, and I'm still working through it. But it's a fascinating book, and I find it as so far especially fascinating because this concept called realism. So one of the themes that I've been discussing, and I think it's consistent with a number of the interviews I've had with certain interviewees, is the inherent value in Catholicism is it's what you'd call the truth proposition. So it's either true or it's false. And if it is true, then there are consequences that follow by necessity of it being true. Whereas if it's false, then it's not worth the time of day. And you read, like, unless I'm mistaken, the whole sort of theme of your book seems to be articulating the truth value underpinning Catholicism. It's not in conflict with science. The two go mutually hand in hand because, Catholicism and science have the same genesis in terms of, they're of God. Have I got that sort of roughly?
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, to a certain degree. Really, the book is about the human ability to discover truth, the way we're made to know truth. The technical term for that is in epistemology. It's what the theory of knowledge. How do humans understand reality? And there's varying opinions on that. And what I try to point out in the book is that if you get the answer to that question wrong, you're going to fall into very irrational positions. And I think what you were pointing out, Tom, is that for Catholics, we very much believe that the human mind can grasp certain objective concepts, ideas that are true about reality, and then follow them to their logical conclusions and then believe that it's necessary to live by the consequences of those ideas. And typically today, there's not a lot of belief that ideas are relevant. We much more tend to think that unless you can see something in a microscope, or you can measure it, you can touch it, smell it, or whatever, or you can put it in a bar chart, then you don't live according to it. So we would have the idea, for instance, that there is a human nature that's given to us that contains there's two genders, and that has consequences about the nature of marriage and whether you should practice birth control and how you should raise children and so on. Whereas most people would say, well, you can only prove things by certain testing and experimenting with human beings. That's the only way you can do it.
Mm. And I guess sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum is this absurd view. So by way of an example, I was once upon a time at the barber getting my haircut, and used to have these great conversations with this certain barber. But one day we were just shooting the breeze about kind of this very issue. And I think it was it Descartes who the theory that, you know, just a mind plugged into a machine, it's entirely possible that you and I actually aren't here having this conversation. You know, this is just, I'm not quite sure how you'd articulate the idea, but essentially it completely undermines reality as we know it. And just me trying to do the mental exercise of working through that idea, I remember thinking, well, you know, take that proposition at its strongest. What do you do with it? You know, let's say we're not actually having this conversation. Let's say when you get out of bed in the morning and decide to go into work, you're not actually getting out of bed in the morning and going into work. It's all quite confusing, but I thought that the only thing we know is our epistemological idea of reality, and that impacts every single decision and action that we take in this life, regardless of whether we like it or not. So I sort of thought that whole idea, as, you know, intellectually fun as it may be, it's completely useless because you can't actually do anything with it.
Yeah, I don't think you can actually live a life that corresponds to that idea. It's absolutely impossible, to where you pretended that whatever you were experiencing was actually the result of just purely random impulses in your brain, or that don't correspond to reality. I mean, there's no one can live according to that perspective of reality and the way we know things. It would drive you crazy. I mean,
you wouldn't get very far. You'd lose a lot of jobs.
Yes.
You'd lose an awful lot. Can I ask, what was the inspiration behind the book?
So the original inspiration, believe it or not, Tom, was I wanted to communicate to traditional Catholics, especially Catholic teaching on science. And what I realized was that there was a certain pre-Vatican II traditional teaching that somehow was not getting passed over that bridge of Vatican II to current traditional Catholics. So the Catholic world was a lot more broad-minded on scientific issues than most traditional Catholics today would warrant. And what I was being taught at the seminary, and what I myself was teaching to the seminarians, I saw clearly somehow was not trickling down to the faithful. And I wanted to do that in a systematic way and put some weight behind it. And we can go into examples in a bit, perhaps. But the book, that was the initial idea, but the book sort of took on a life of its own. It became something much broader than that over time. And so the thesis ended up being something much less practical and much more sort of philosophical on the importance of having a realist perspective of reality so as not to fall into just irrationality. That was the overarching thesis that the book turned out to have. But the initial impetus was to communicate that traditional Catholic perspective on science and religion.
Mm. And would you be able to give some examples of things that you saw were not trickling down to the faithful? Yes,
absolutely. So something like the question of the age of the universe or the age of the earth, is it against the faith to believe that the earth is 4.55 billion years old? Is it against the faith to believe that the universe is 13.7 billion years old? Does that attack God? Does that attack the Bible? You know, are these, is it possible to be a Catholic and believe in the Big Bang Theory, or even evolution, even Darwinian evolution, or are those things forbidden by the church? And I think there's not a few traditional Catholics out there would believe that somehow the idea of an ancient earth or an ancient universe undermines scripture, or even that Darwinian evolution in its purely scientific form would undermine the faith as well. That, in other words, these are theological questions, that people think that these are theological questions, when in fact the church has clearly indicated that they are not theological questions. They do not concern the faith. In other words, the faith, the Catholic faith is not, or the magisterium is not going to teach us on that. And it's not going to link up what we believe in the Apostles' Creed to these scientific propositions. It's going to tell us rather that an ancient Earth or an ancient universe can be compatible to what we believe. That it's not incompatible with what we believe. Even Darwinian evolution is in theory not incompatible with the faith.
Okay, that's fascinating. I did have a number of points that I was going to shoot at you, and I've sort of lost the order of them, but I'm fingers crossed I'll tick them all off before our time is up. But just on that point, that raises to me a really, really interesting question, because if you break scripture down, roughly speaking, into Old Testament and New Testament, the New Testament is relatively easy to navigate when compared to the Old Testament. And it's the Old Testament that seems to pose all those dilemmas, create those ethical and scientific issues that sort of pit allegedly science against religion. So in terms of somebody sitting down and picking up Genesis or similar texts, how does one do that and not fall into a risk of misinterpreting it or incorrectly reading it?
So that's a great question, Tom. I mean, when I was teaching Genesis at Holy Cross Seminary in Goulburn, what I gave them was the teaching of, first of all, the encyclical of Pope Leo XIII, that it explains to us how we are to read passages like Genesis 1 that describe the origins of the universe, and then go to magisterial statements, other magisterial statements, such as the statements of the Pontifical Biblical Commission under St. Pius X and other popes, and then also the seminary manuals. So it's typical that you would have textbooks for seminarians on scriptural issues pre-Vatican II. And at Holy Cross, we have a nice library, and I would get these out, and because I'm like, I need to teach this class. So I would read these manuals and be informed of the Catholic spirit in interpreting Genesis. And these books made clear that the main purpose of Genesis is to teach supernatural truths that we could not know of our own reason. That God wanted to give us revelation. Those are truths that we could not figure out on our own. Therefore it's not a science book. So what I found was that there was a broad range of opinions about how Genesis matched up with the scientific data of the time that they were studying at that time. And well, the scientific question is left to science. But what we are bound to believe by the church is that Genesis teaches, for instance, that we all originate from Adam and Eve, that there is one God who is at the origin of the entire universe, that he is infinitely good, that he created the human race, things like that. But not that the universe is a certain age, or that the universe developed in a certain way. Those things we are not obliged to believe on de fide, as a de fide proposition.
Okay. And so some of these issues are really difficult to flesh out in their entirety when in limited time. But the question I'd like to ask in that regard is, do you feel that it might be proposed that is there a danger in that approach in the scripture losing its authority?
There is a danger. There is a danger, definitely, if people are not instructed properly, if they have the impression that there's only one way to interpret Genesis 1, and that is the perspective of many fundamentalist Protestants. I don't know if you've heard of the Institution of Answers in Genesis. It's kind of ironic, but they have a museum in Kentucky that's run by an Australian from Queensland. His name is Ken Ham. So, they teach their youth that there is only one way to interpret Genesis 1, and that is that God created the universe in 6 24-hour days in exactly the order described by Genesis. And if you believe that, and then you go on and you study science, and the scientific data that can be observed does not support that at all, that shows that there's a very long history to the universe. It's much older than 6,000 years old. Then you have a conflict between faith and reason. So I think it does take extra teaching to communicate to Catholics that the church and even the fathers have had different understandings of the scientific import of Genesis 1, and that we are more than willing to let science factor in our understanding of that scientific import. And so, you know, while we hold on to those supernatural truths, and those will never change, and they never have changed, the way we interpret Genesis with regards to the scientific import, yes, is going to be conditioned by what we learn about the universe.
Okay. A lot of your works in that book, I believe, you build upon works and you refer to, is it Father Stanley, is it Yaki? Yaki. So who was he?
Father Yaki was a Benedictine priest who also studied physics. And so he had a brilliant mind, and early on in his teaching career, he had trouble with his vocal cords. And he said that after he experienced this problem, he was condemned to write because he could no longer teach. And so what he did was he did a unique form of Catholic apologetics, in that he discovered, or he brought to public view, the work of a early 20th century scientist, Pierre Duhem, who exposed the fact that science as we know it today essentially began in the Middle Ages. So the tale of the Enlightenment period, we're talking about 1700s, 1800s, was that the dark Middle Ages kept people in complete ignorance so that the church could have control over them. And then along came these heroes of enlightenment like Galileo and Newton, who liberated people from theology and from the church itself, and finally set their minds free by telling them the truth about the universe. And so overturning religion as a path to truth. This is completely made up. It's utterly made up from start to finish. So Pierre Duhem proved that because he showed that the medieval Catholic world was the most broad-minded world ever. Certainly much more broad-minded than the world we live in, Tom, today in the 21st century.
Not hard to believe, Father.
Not hard to believe at all. So in the Catholic Middle Ages, there was this very open-minded approach to understanding God's natural world. And at the same time, these men had a very deep faith, and they effectively invented the scientific method. They taught people how to discover truths about the material world in a way that had never been done before. And their method of finding scientific truths was informed by their theology. This is the astonishing thing. And that's what led, what they started led to what we know as the scientific revolution. And so Father Yaki popularized this truth that really science and the scientific method started in the Catholic Middle Ages.
Okay. And what I've picked up on something you said earlier, you refer to reintroducing some of these issues and topics through the lens of a traditional Catholic. And I guess there's two ways to interpret that. One is I think the initial reaction of, let's say, somebody my age would go traditional Catholic, that peculiar, unique form of Catholicism that exists today, as opposed to, approximately 2,000 years of continuous history extending back to the birth of Christ and moving forward to roughly 1960, 70. And the interesting thing is, I think it was, you've had encyclicals like, is it Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason, which have tried to capture and articulate a similar message, but something radical happened at the Second Vatican Council that really blew a lot of these issues open. So how can you speak on that issue a little bit?
Yeah. So the tension between reason and faith has always been there. And the Fides et Ratio you're referring to is an encyclical of John Paul II, correct? So that tension has always been there. And something I really try to point out in my book is that there are different approaches to how humans understand reality. And the modern way is to think that the only way humans can know things is through their senses. And then if you can't receive it through your senses, then you can't know that it's true. And of course, God is not someone who can be sensed directly because of the fact that he's a pure spirit. So we have to access God much more through our mind than through our senses. So this what we call an empiricist epistemology effectively rules out God. And this epistemology became very popular in our day because of the successes of science. Because science was something that seemed to be very objective and reproducible. If someone does an experiment in China, then you can do the same experiment in Australia and come to the same results in theory. And so we both agree, right? And meanwhile, philosophy and theology, nobody agrees about that. So why don't we just reduce all human knowing to what can be provided through the senses? And so that's like the zeitgeist, that's the spirit of our age. And traditionally the church rejected that. They said, no, humans can know not just through their senses, but their ideas as well. The ideas they form, like the idea of justice or the idea of love, has relevance for objective reality. It tells me something true about reality, even though I can't see love. I can't see justice as such. There's no like quantitative thing that is like, oh, I'm holding justice or something like that. So what effectively happened with Vatican II is this great effort to adapt religion to that empiricist epistemology, to try to say, well, let's take Catholicism and make it as empiricist as possible. This attempt, ultimately, it destroys things like scripture studies, because then you can't take anything on authority anymore. You just analyze text. That's all you do, and study history. It also destroys religion in the sense that you are only able to have a subjective religion. What modernism is taking empiricism and making a religion out of it. So what happens, you just base religion purely on your own personal experiences, your feelings about God. You don't base it on the catechism, which is a set of ideas. You don't base it on the Apostles' Creed, which is a set of dogmas. It's just all based on what you feel. And from that point of view, religion is something purely personal. It's not objective anymore, and it's not even rational anymore.
Mm. And the interesting thing, I think personally, about that, once again, putting myself in or trying to put myself in the shoes of the everyday young person, is that idea has so much force, because I really think there is something missing in society today, and something of substance. And so I think a lot of younger people are looking for an answer that extends beyond the empirical, because I think when you discuss ideas of justice, ideas of love, the questions of not just how, but why, these are questions that every single person asks from the earliest of ages, and they only stop asking when you're told to stop asking. But there's that natural inquisitive mind, and we've sort of been sold short in a huge way. And like the idea of realism and that Catholicism is not incompatible with science. I think it's one of the most important ideas to peddle, because you can actually look a young person in the face and say, there is a good reason for getting up and going to Mass on Sunday. There is a good thing. There is a good reason for slightly inconveniencing yourself, because the reason you are doing that is real. It's as real as you and me sitting here having this conversation. It's not a feeling, a warm and fuzzy, sensation that you get because you're taking part in something with a bunch of other people. It's real and it's tangible. Sorry, Father, jump in.
Yeah. So I think one thing that makes young people so unstable today, and I'm not talking about you, Tom, but
it could be,
is the fact that they are not given truth. Our minds are made for truth, and because of that, we want clear ideas to guide us in life. But what we do today instead is we say, there are no clear ideas that you can guide your life. You have to make up everything for yourself. So you take 10 people and you read a passage in a book and you ask those 10 people, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? And you go through, and in the end, everybody's like, well, what's the answer? I want to know what is the true answer about how you read this passage. And they're not given that. And you just walk away as a human being. You're so unsatisfied and you have no roots. You're like, what? How do I live my life since I don't know the truth? And you're just told, well, I'm empowering you and I'm giving you the ability to define yourself. But that's very unsettling. It makes a person very insecure because you have to make up everything yourself. You have to do all the work yourself.
And if a short anecdote on that point, my friend, he'll hate me doing this because fingers crossed he actually listens to my show. Very, very close friend, wonderful person, practicing Protestant on what he describes as a religious journey. But we were talking recently and he goes to different apologetics groups or religious discussion groups. And I remember him telling me that once upon a time, he was comparing and contrasting the different groups he went to. And he went to one whereby, people sat down and they read the passage from the New Testament about love. And then at the end of reading the passage, everybody turned to look to each other. And the question was, what does love mean to you? And he's not the sort of person that can do anything meaningful with such a open-ended, vague question. He just said it drove him absolutely crazy because that's not what he wanted. He wanted direction. He wanted something of substance. But I think, and this is just something that I seem to be finding the more I talk to different people like yourself and some of the other people that I've spoken to, is that the trump card that Catholicism holds is that it never is without an answer of substance. The answer may be inconvenient, and that's something that the individual who receives the answer has to confront. And that's a completely different issue. That's difficult. But in terms of actually getting the answer, it's because it's a claim to truth, and it always seems to have an answer of substance.
Yes. And I hope your viewers don't get the idea that we're contradicting that by what I said about evolution and the Big Bang and all that, in the sense that there are some things on which the church says, this does not concern the faith. I'm only going to teach you these supernatural truths. In those realms of Catholic dogma, things are super clear. And as I say, as a Catholic, I don't think you could really ask for more from the church as far as the guidance you get on how you get to heaven, the whole moral code between the creed, the commandments, and the sacraments. And it's just crystal clear. But at the same time, the church is not going to overstep her bounds and impinge upon the proper rights of the natural disciplines, natural sciences. And I don't want people to get the impression that I myself don't have a strong opinion on these questions. But what I want to say as a Catholic priest, the church is telling me, look, you have the freedom to look at the science yourself and draw your own conclusions. Whatever you find is not going to be incompatible with the faith. So in my book, I expose the arguments for the Big Bang Theory and why I find them conclusive. They're very compelling. For one thing, the Big Bang Theory was proposed by a Catholic priest. I mean, so that should indicate that I'm not in a danger zone here. But for me to conclude that the Big Bang Theory is compelling, I do it purely on the basis of science. Meanwhile, in my book as well, I look very closely and I hope fairly at Darwin's theory of random mutation and natural selection leading to the biological diversity of the world around us. And I come to the conclusion that it's not able to explain much of anything of that diversity, that it has very little explanatory power. And again, that's from just investigating the science. This is not the church telling me what to believe. She's telling me either way, it's compatible with the Catholic faith. But I think I've got very clear ideas on those subjects, but they're not subjects of faith.
If I can press you just for a moment longer on that point, because, for example, I have read Genesis, and if you read Genesis, you come across peculiarities like, that the world was made in 7 days, but the sun only comes up halfway through the picture, and that the sun is how we judge, the 24-hour human day. So I certainly haven't studied it in any great depth, but most big picture issues I sort of found, and reading some commentaries on it, that you can sort of safely toe that line between religion and science for the reasons that you've proposed. Are there any things in the Old Testament that really are difficult to tackle in terms of pitting a proposition made in the Old Testament against science?
There are definitely difficulties. But the Catholic attitude is that we must always try to find the sense that God intended. We all know that words are ambiguous. Words are signs of meaning, and because of that, there can be many different significations of a word, because they're only signs. They don't get you directly to the meaning. They only point in the direction of the meaning. They can mean many different things. And that's why you need someone to authoritatively interpret the Bible for you. And when we look at the fathers, their position on Genesis 1, some of them thought that Genesis 1 was purely allegorical as far as the days. The days, for instance, were a progression in the knowledge of the angels. That's what that meant. That was St. Augustine, or the Alexandrian school under Origen. Origen was not someone who made it to being a church father, but he was a very early scripture interpreter. Others held a strictly literal view, and still others, like the Cappadocian fathers, they held that the whole universe was created in an instant, and that it's stretched out in 6 days in Genesis 1 as an explanatory tool to help communicate that God made everything and he made it in an ordered fashion. So there are many different ways in which we could understand Genesis 1. If I can just go briefly through one interpretation that would be called concordance, where we would take those 6 days and we would try to match it up with what we know with science today and see how they're compatible. One idea is that, well, with the Big Bang Theory, the universe starts with an initial burst of energy. Over long periods of time, stars and galaxies form, and then those stars explode and emit elements, and eventually our own solar system forms. And then you have the Earth starting off as a hot ball of fire with this thick atmosphere. And then the idea would be that on the first day, because the first verse of Genesis, in the beginning, God created heavens and the earth. So that happens first. And then the first day, there's light. So before there's light, there's the heaven and the earth. So the earth is there. And then there's light. That's when the atmosphere is able to let light through. And then you have the division of the earth and the waters. It's believed, scientists would hold that the earth was initially just covered with water, and then the land emerged. So that would be day 2. And then the plants come on day 3. That's when God first seeds the earth with plants. Then the sun, the moon, and the stars would appear when the atmosphere further thins up, and you can actually see through the atmosphere. And then day 5 would be when God puts the fishes into the water. And then day 6 would be when he puts animals on the land. So, I mean, that's one way of interpreting Genesis 1 literally. Of course, we're understanding each day as a long period of time, as permitted by Pius X in the Biblical Commission. He says you can understand day as a long period of time. And in that way, we make, or we understand Genesis in a very literal sense. That's one possible way of interpreting it.
Okay, that's absolutely fascinating. And now I guess I've been commissioned, and I need to go away, do my homework, and finish your book. Father, this has been a thoroughly enjoyable chat. My last question to you will be one of a slightly different nature. So, I'm a young Catholic growing up in 2020. 26 years of age. It is a pretty difficult society to grow up in as not only a Catholic, but a traditional Catholic for reasons that don't need much explanation. What would be your message to a young Catholic boy or girl growing up today?
So I think the main thing, Tom, would be the importance of developing a prayer life. You've really got, if you're going to do religion, you've got to take time out to pray. I can't overemphasize how important that is. It's so easy today because we have so much access to information, we have so much access to technology, and especially because we're so materialized today. That we don't relate to the spiritual because we don't do spiritual things. So for young people to take time out to make a retreat at Holy Cross Seminary, to do meditation each day, or to do spiritual reading, to pray the rosary. I think the example, as I say, of my grandfather, who was so prayerful and spent hours in prayer every day, Stations of the Cross, 15 decades of the rosary, was a beautiful example for me, just to inspire me to try to take a spiritual life seriously. It is a life. And it's a life that's very different from the Facebook and the Twitter life,
Yeah, it is.
And if young people are looking for a certain meaning, to be rooted in something eternal that goes way beyond all the riots and the coronavirus and the news flashes and all that, then the prayer life is definitely where it's at.
Father, that is a beautiful message of substance. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me today in the lounge room. I've thoroughly appreciated it and enjoyed it.
It's been a pleasure, Tom.
Thank you.